Molweni bantu abahle basephondweni lam endibathandayo. Igama lam nguSihle-Isipho Bikitsha. I am the head of research apha Funda Wande. Ndingumntana wenu ke nam, ndingowalapha ephondweni, ndingumamthembu, umamngqongo, ozalwa libhelekazi, owendele emazizini. Shine, uba siyazalana. It is such a privilege, Luvuyo noXolo kum namhlanje, ukuba nethuba to share with you findings from the Behavioural Science Pedagogical Change Intervention ibiyenziwe Eastern Cape for 2024 in 18 schools specifically. So, mandinixelele a little bit more about this intervention, nomnqweno wayo, and what it is that we wish to do with it specifically. This intervention was done here in the Eastern Cape, as I've already said, and it was done in 18 schools specifically. And these 18 schools are divided into 3 arms. So what arms are those? The first arm are the control group, which is the group that we do nothing to at all. We don't touch it. So they didn't receive any intervention at all. And then we have the standard schools. And the standard schools have what we call the Funda Wande triple cocktail. And that is the learning and teaching support materials. They have the teacher training. And we also have coaching and support that happens, right? So that is the standard arm, which is the second one. And then the third arm is the behavioral intervention arm. And that is basically the intervention arm that received a package which had afternoon workshops that were embedded with behavioral principles to be able to shift teacher practice. The overall very ambitious goal of this entire project was to see, can we be able to shift teacher practice? So that means to be able to influence how teachers teach and the kind of strategy that they use as they teach, so that we move away from the form of teaching towards the substance of being able to consistently use the actual teacher guides. And you might ask, why is that important? Like, why does it matter that teachers are using the teacher guides systematically and with fidelity? What we know with structured pedagogy is that consistent usage of the actual guide itself enables increased exposure for learners so that every single day they are consistently learning to read, learning to write, learning phonics, and learning comprehension in a systematic approach. And in that way, we can know that if that curriculum is followed systematically, we could be able to gain much more better learning outcomes. So let's go into the main findings. So what did we find in this actual study? I'm going to divide our findings into 4 main categories. The first category is the use of materials. The second category is the use of instructional time. So how do teachers actually use their time in the classroom? The third is implementation fidelity, which is really being able to follow the method steps that are instructed in the teacher guide to be able to do the work itself. And finally, it's instructional quality. And those 4 findings are really going to be able to show that we have the power to be able to influence and shift teacher practice, even if, as we see in the study, that it's not yet significant, but that small shift alone, we know, can really make a significant difference in the life of the learner. It can be the difference between a learner that can never read and the learner that becomes an accurate, fast, great reader that's able to do so much more with their life overall. So let's go into the first category of what we found, the use of materials. So in behavioral classrooms, we found that teachers use more Funda Wande materials. So they use the learner guides, so the learners are using more of their own materials. They use anthologies, they use flashcards. And so what you immediately see in the behavioral classroom specifically is the actual richness of materials usage and how teachers are incorporating those multiple materials. We see that they are doing that even better in behavioral classrooms, even than they are doing in the standard Funda Wande classrooms. The second is that the teacher guide was the dominant instructional source for the teacher in the behavioral classroom specifically. So whilst in the standard and control group, teachers used other workbooks, which means that there is variability in usage. So sometimes they'll use a DBE or a Pearson or an Oxford, which isn't a bad thing technically. But effectively what you're doing is that the teaching practice is a lot more sporadic. It's a lot more spread. You don't actually have a systematic plan that ensures that there's full coverage of all the material. So what we're seeing in the behavioral intervention group is that the Funda Wande teacher guide became the actual backbone for the resources that they were actually using in the classroom. And then finally, in terms of the usage of materials, teachers in behavioral schools were far more likely to prepare flashcards as prescribed in the TG. So it's a very small but a very powerful indicator that tells us that a kind of planning happens when teachers are using a book systematically, because then they know what are some of the materials that I should be pulling in that have already been prescribed, which means that there's more lesson planning that's actually happening that results in the usage of the available materials. So the overall message when it comes to materials usage is that the behavioral intervention worked. Teachers shifted towards using the teacher guide, and the program's materials became the backbone of their teaching practice and instruction. Then let's go to the second, which is the use of instructional time. So we know that CAPS, and Funda Wande follows the CAPS methodology, has prescribed times of use this amount of time, for instance, for phonics, use this amount of time for writing. So what did it then look like for our study and our intervention in terms of how teachers use their time? So across all the schools, time varied widely because then teachers are using different methods. But behavioral classrooms kept learners engaged for longer. So what do we mean by that? So in non-instructional ways, so there was a lot less disruptions, less admin tasks that were being done during that same time. It was lowest in behavioral classrooms in terms of like the fidelity of time, right? It wasn't great, but it was better than the control group and the standard group as well. Behavioral lessons included a wider range of instructional activities, so averaging 7 per lesson compared to 5 in control schools. So they used all the resources available within the time, even though the actual fidelity to time was not as great. In the behavioral classrooms, the non-instructional disruptions were at least 6% lower compared to the number that you see in the actual control schools, where you see a lot more disruption, a lot more admin tasks, which actually takes away teachers from the actual instructional time itself. So you're seeing teachers using more of the resources, which enables them for learners to be engaged for far longer, which means that they're doing less routine classroom management tasks during the instructional time compared, for instance, to the control group. So what we're seeing with the behavioral classrooms is that there is more time on task. Learners need the time on the task to be able to begin to grasp it. So there's more exposure to reading and writing because they're spending more time on task. And we also know that this is how children start to learn, right? Like when they have the time on task, when they have that kind of attention and connection to the work itself. And then let's go to implementation fidelity. Like, so how well were our behavioral teachers, for instance, actually using the material in the way that it's intended to be used compared to the standard versus to the control group? So behavioral teachers implemented about 23% of how the steps that are actually given in the methodology guide compared to 13% for standard teachers. So what we're seeing, so this is almost kind of like an indice or indicator of following the steps. We're seeing that teachers in the behavioral group followed about 23% of the steps, whereas teachers in the standard group only followed about 13% of the steps, right? So whilst overall fidelity is still relatively low, we haven't really quite cracked that code of ensuring that there is fidelity in the methodology usage, but behavioral teachers were at least referring to the teacher guide more consistently and following it a bit better than the standard group alone, or let alone the control group, which would be using a lot more variability. So the stronger gains were in the early steps of the lesson. So we can see that they use the teacher guide a lot more effectively, for instance, in morning meetings, in phonics, in listening and speaking. And then fidelity drops in terms of life skills specifically and in writing tasks. So this is really useful in being able to understand. So where is fidelity good? Where we can be able to leverage some of the gains, and where is it not so good? And we can see it's in the life skills, it's in the writing, and our intervention can now become more targeted to being able to ensure that we're seeing gains in that too. So what is the message around implementation fidelity? Behavioral teachers are using the teacher guide more, but implementation depth remains a challenge overall across the system. And then finally, let's go into instructional quality. So Behavioral classrooms offered a greater variety of reading, writing, and speaking opportunities. And this, I think, is very directly connected to the time and task. In the behavioral classrooms, we actually see group guided reading where you have learners with different and varied abilities being able to read together. And group guided reading is a really key and critical cornerstone of Funda Wande approach. And this was so common in behavioral groups, which is really, really exciting, but it was extremely absent in control groups. So there was none at all, actually. And in standard groups, you can see it, but it's very low still. So I think that's really one of the great successes of this intervention specifically, where we're seeing group guided reading, matching learners with different abilities, being able to read together. And then learners in behavioral classrooms read more. At higher levels, they had more sentences and paragraphs, and they wrote more than the standard classrooms, which is really, really promising because it means that the more time on task you had, the more opportunities there are for increased reading, for correct passage reading, for accuracy, for fluency to really improve. What I think is less positive that we do need to consider is that writing was lower actually in the control groups. And I think that really speaks to that earlier on indication around we're seeing fidelity when it comes to phonics, but far less when it comes to writing and life skills. And so that already itself is translating in terms of the amount of time that happens with writing in the classroom. What is the message around the instructional quality? Quality is improving where behavioral principles are being applied. But deep learning practices, especially comprehension, extended writing, and meaningful talk, are not yet routine, where learners are really speaking back and forth with their teachers. So there's a lot more depth that we need to get to. But what this tells us at the very least is that we can shift teacher practice. We can't always say, oh, teachers are doing one thing, right? But we know that teacher strategies are really critical for being able to shift learner outcomes. And what this study shows us is that we can do something about that. So what does this mean, Mandava? These findings are both encouragement and caution. Encouragement because teachers in behavioral schools are changing their practice. They use the teacher guide more, they engage learners more, and they create more opportunities for reading. But caution is that implementation fidelity remains low still. Learners are reading more words but writing little. They're speaking more but mostly in chorus or short answers, and there's a lot more work that needs to happen in terms of larger passage reading. The study really shows us what is possible, but also how much work remains to embed high-quality teaching consistently. There are a couple of implications for action that I think we need to consider as we move forward. The one, to deepen teacher guide usage, we need to build not just compliance, but actual mastery. Teachers should implement all components, not just some. And I think the more confident teachers feel in being able to utilize our materials, the better they will be at deepening their teacher guide usage. Second, we need to prioritize writing and comprehension. So ensuring that every lesson has opportunities for learners to write meaningfully and engage in comprehension activities. So that's really, really important. The third is that we need to continue to strengthen coaching. So we're seeing that the afternoon workshops, those one-on-one times where teachers feel supported, where there's that scaffold of other teachers sharing how they're doing and what their practice looks like in the PLCs, it shows promise, right? So it means let's continue to support teachers with feedback, with modeling, with accountability, and the sharing of how their learners are also performing and how their teaching practice actually is influencing the outcomes of learners. And then we need to continue to monitor fidelity at scale. So we need to use tools that help us to actually be able to track usage and how classroom practice is influencing learner outcomes. So what are some of the key takeaways that we're seeing from the study? The first is the importance of support on preparation. So ongoing preparation support enables teachers confidence and gets them to actually use the teacher guide. So when they have a space, like the workshops that they were having in the study, it means that they're sharing practices, like when I went on, and that translates into their ability and clarity on how to actually effectively use the teacher guide better. The second is that we need to strengthen in-school professional learning communities. So how do we leverage the existing professional learning communities to foster collaboration amongst teachers? It already exists. It's in the system. How do we take it and make sure it works to be able to drive forward some of the key gaps that we're identifying in the system as a whole? So PLCs at this particular juncture could be supporting extended writing in classrooms. They could be supporting comprehension specifically. And if we can really be able to tap into the existing system and scaffold and support teachers effectively, what we will see is promise for teacher practice to improve, which ultimately leads to improvement in learner outcomes. I think this is really, really exciting because we know that teacher strategies are at the very heart of learning. And the fact that we can do something about it, I think this is what the study shows. We can do something. We can improve teacher practice, and we can support teachers better so that they feel that they are more confident and more capable to do the work that they have to do every single day in building the next generation, in fortifying the learning abilities of our children, and incapacitating them to be able to count with confidence and read for meaning. Masenzeni, the work has only just begun. This just tells us a picture of where we are, even though it's really small, but it tells us that together, systematically, strategically, we can make the change.